Hello friends, welcome back to this brand new video whereby we are going to discuss about the useReducer hook. In the previous video, we discussed about the useContext hook whereby we discussed that it allows you to subscribe to React context without introducing nesting. We discussed about various examples and we found out that it can be used to manage global state by wrapping our context provider to the main application such that we can be able to access state in all the components. And in this video, we are going to be concentrating on the useReducer hook, which is basically a React hook for managing more complex state logic. At the start of these tutorials, we discussed about useState hook, which was basically for managing simple state. And this one here, useReducer, is mostly for managing more complex state logic. So we are going to start with an example to be able to understand it more. And like we said, we start by calling the hook. So we are going to say useReducer hook. And we also import it from React, as you can see. So let's hover and look at what React tells about it. So let's come here and read brief information about it. As you can see, it is usually preferable to use state when you have complex state logic. We already discussed that actually. And if the logic involves multiple sub-values, which is something fine, it also lets you optimize performance for components that trigger deep updates because you can pass the dispatch down instead of the callbacks. We are going to discuss more when we get to a real-world example. So let's proceed and first get the basics. So like we said, we already called the hook because hooks are functions. We already discussed that. So inside here, we need to know what it returns and what it takes as a parameter. Basically, it takes two parameters. The first one is the reducer function. So let's call it reducer function. And the second parameter is the initial state. Just like the useState hook, but the useState hook only took initial state and returned the state variable and the function for updating that state variable. But in here, the useReducer is taking two parameters, the reducer function and the initial state. So we also need to know what it actually returns because we can come here and destructure it. So this hook returns the state itself and the dispatch. Let's come here and say const. We can basically destructure it and have it as state and the dispatch. And it's going to be useReducer into reducer function in the initial state. So basically the dispatch is a way to send actions to our reducer. So we are going to understand more when, just like we had a setter function in useState, here we use dispatch, which helps us to send actions to our reducer. So we can come here and have our very basic example to be able to understand this concept. In our example, we are going to be dealing with a counter just like we did on the useState, but here it's going to be a little advanced because we are trying to understand how the useReducer works and be able to differentiate it from the useState and know when and where to use useReducer and when and where to use useState. That's actually going to be at the end so that you guys can be able to differentiate when you should use a useState hook and when you should use a useReducer hook. So for now, we only know that complex state logic is for useReducer, and for normal state logic, you can use a useState hook. But we are going to see more. Let's first have this example. So we are going to say const, and our reducer function, we can actually call it counter reducer, just like this. And it's going to be an arrow function. By the way, the reducer function also takes two parameters, and that is the state, and it also receives something called action. This is also an object actually, and we are going to understand it more afterwards. Actually, down here we can use a switch statement, and inside here we are going to look at action, and this switch is going to be interested in the type. This is basically an object, and we are accessing the type method on the action object. So inside here, we can actually have our various cases. For example, we can look at incrementing state, decrementing state, And we can also look at the normal state. If there is no action and there is nothing to work on the state, then we are going to stay with the state as it is. But maybe before introducing it to the various cases here, we can first have our initial state to be able to understand this counter example very well. Let's come here and say const initial state, and it's gonna be an object. Unlike in useState hook, here using useReducer, most of the times the state is gonna be an object because it's really something good to be able to manage complex state in a predictable manner. So you are gonna be having state as an object most of the times, but you don't have to say that state must be an object. No, it's always an object just to be able to make it easier to control complex state changes. So we are going to say count, and we can initialize it to 0 for the start. So inside here we can look at the first case for incrementing this count. Actually, we don't have this like this, and we actually have it at the end. And for the increment, we are gonna return count, and it's gonna be state.count because we already saw that our state has the count key and is an object, so it's actually state. It's gonna be state.count plus 1. And by the way, down here we can also try to decrement and have it as another case. It's gonna be decrement, and inside here we are gonna return count, and it's gonna be state.count minus 1. We can just use this for testing. You can use something else like plus 5 minus 5. It is totally okay, but just here we are trying to understand how this useReducer hook works. So we can basically use anything like 1. Let's proceed and also have our default, so that if no action is being taken, we can just return the default. Basically, we can return our state unchanged, just like that. So basically, we now have our initial state, and we also have our reducer. Actually, our initial state should be out like this because we are going to take it as a parameter, as a second parameter in our useReducer hook. So we can basically come here and have our useReducer like we agreed. It returns the state in the dispatch function. So we can come here and say useReducer, and inside here we already have our reducer function, which is actually the counter reducer. It's up counter reducer, and the second parameter is the initial state. We already have it because our state only has the count. So I think we have a typo. We can come here and fix it first. It's counter reducer, so we can also come here. Okay, it's good now. So basically what we are going to do, we can come here and have our div or our paragraph, and maybe we can now be able to access our state. And we are mainly interested in this count here. It's actually here. So we can just look at state.count in our browser, so we can be able to tell and know when to update. As you can see, our state is here, which is basically 0 for the start, but you realize there is a problem. We actually need it here. We no longer need this. We can have our paragraph here, which is this one here, and now we need a way of incrementing and decrementing this state. That is by using the dispatch. We are able to access these actions here, the increment and the decrement. So to do that, we are going to come here and add some buttons. We can say increment, and maybe down here we can also say decrement like that. So inside here we are going to say on click. By the way, here we can even write an inline function or if you want we can write it outside here and outside our JSX, but it is still okay. We can come here and write our inline function like this. So basically we need to call the dispatch, and inside here we pass our preferred type. So basically our type is called increment if we are incrementing, and we also have type decrement if we want to decrement, so which is basically on click, and we are going to say dispatch, and we are going to dispatch an action of type, it's actually type, not type of, type, and it's going to be decrement like that. Let's first check it well. Okay, that's it. Let's try to come here and click. As you can see, they are too congested, so we can come here and pass a small style. We can just say style, and we can maybe pass margin of certain. Okay, it's better. We can try to increment. As you can see, it's working perfect, and when we try to decrement, it's also working perfect. So basically this is how the useReducer hook works, and in more complex scenarios you're still able to follow this procedure that we just followed. We basically needed to know that the useReducer accepts two parameters, which is the counter reducer and the initial state, and returns the state in the dispatch, which basically helps us to send our actions to the reducer. So in a more complex scenario, you could also use this very hook to be able to control state inside a use context. For example, let's come here. In our previous video, we looked at context API and the use context hook. We discussed that when you have your state here, you can literally pass it inside here and be able to access it in other components. And in bigger projects, you are going to be using the useReducer hook, because we agreed that it also works like useState hook, because they are all used to manage state, just that the useReducer hook is used to manage more complex state, whereas the useState hook is used to manage simple state. So inside here, while using use context hook, you can also use a useReducer hook to be able to control your state. Just like here where we use a user object, you could possibly use a useReducer and have your reducer function in the initial state, which could basically be the initial state of the user object. So inside here you would return state, which has all the keys on the user object, and you could also return the dispatch function to be able to send action to the reducer, which can basically be something nicer. So with those, I think that was all with the useReducer hook, and it was actually our very last hook. In the next video, we are going to be discussing about custom hooks, that is being able to write stateful logic in isolation and be able to reuse it in various components. And if you like this video and would like to see more tutorials like this, please consider subscribing to the channel and hit the bell icon. And thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next video.